Now the fun begins. We can start to animate. My robot mesh layer is currently not referenced. I'm going to click that button till I see the letter R, and now I can't select it in the viewport. I've got my little cylinder here. I want to move that to some random location and level it to the floor. Make sure it's actually touching the ground. And just so that we don't lose that location, we can freeze its transforms. Modify freeze transformations. And we can start creating keyframes on these joints. We want to be in the rotate tool and gimbal mode. Double click, make sure you're in gimbal mode. And create keyframes. Let's say we want to start in some more natural rotation. Maybe I'll turn this a little bit. Select some of these. Get in closer. Maybe rotate that too. If you wish, you can also use the outliner. Remember, we can select both of these with Control-Shift and rotate them at once if we wish. And if that's a good pose to start from, we want to create keyframes on all of the joints. If we just drag a rectangle to select them all, we're not actually selecting them all. It looks like they're all selected, but in fact they're not. We've only selected the parent, and these all look like they're selected. So that's kind of problematic in Maya. You want to open up the outliner and investigate. Hold down Shift and click the plus sign and open this up, and you'll see joint swivel is in fact the only thing selected. So if I created keyframes now, I would only be creating keyframes on that object. Well, we don't want that, of course. We want to select the entire hierarchy. One way to do that is to select them all in the outliner just by dragging your mouse across. The other way is to select the hierarchy from the menus. If I have joint swivel selected, then I can go up to Edit, Select Hierarchy, and that will explicitly select all of the child objects. And I can now create keyframes. Since I'm only creating rotation keys, I don't want to use the S key. That will create keyframes for translate and scale as well. My timeline is on frame 1. All of my hierarchy is selected, and I want to keyframe just their rotations. And the keyboard shortcut for that is Shift-E, or capital E. And now you'll see rotate X, Y, and Z have animation curves incoming, so they turn this pink color. And we can select any one of these joints, and we will see that the active rotations are in red or pink, and the lock channels, of course, are shown in gray. That's our first pose at frame 1. Now we can work either from a pose-to-pose methodology or from a layered animation style. In the 12 principles of animation, there's this dichotomy between so-called straight-ahead animation and pose-to-pose animation. Straight ahead means drawing one frame after another in direct sequence. Pose-to-pose means blocking out the most basic, essential movements in advance and then filling in all of the in-betweens later. There's no analog to straight ahead in 3D computer animation. We don't really do that. But we do have something called layered style. In pose-to-pose 3D computer animation, you set up one pose and then another one, and you interpolate between the poses on the entire character. In the layered style, you work on each object separately. It doesn't really matter which way you do it. So if I want to do a layered style, I would only really work on one thing at a time. For example, let's say I wanted the entire object to just swivel around only in one axis at this point. So I would go down a few frames, let's say 20 frames, and then only rotate the swivel, and then only key that. I can press Shift-E in a little keyframe. And then I can scrub across there and you'll see that's been animated. And in the layered style, I could now, for example, animate some other attribute of some other object. Like, for example, this shoulder rotation. I could have that start on frame 10, for example. Shift-E to create a keyframe. And then let's say by frame 30, it had spun down a little bit. And that'll create some overlapping actions so that the rotations of those two objects are not exactly aligned in time. They're not exactly simultaneous. Shift-E to create a keyframe there. Rewind and play it. And we want to make sure that we're playing back at the correct speed. So right-click on your timeline and check your playback speed. Make sure it's set to play every frame max real time. So you can see that the rotations of each of those two objects are not aligned. We've got some overlap, and we can see that in the graph editor. Let's select them both, joint swivel and joint shoulder. Window, animation editors, graph editor, press the F key, and here is the overlapping action. We have a rotation here, which is rotate X for the swivel or the base here, and then we have rotate Y, which is the rotations for the shoulder going down. And you'll see that they happen at different points in time. If we were to switch over to a pose-to-pose method here, what we would do is we would set keyframes on all of the joints and then go to a different point in time and set keyframes on all of those joints once again. I'll scroll down here to a few frames past the last motion, let's say frame 40. And once again, select the entire hierarchy. Select joint swivel and go to the edit menu and choose select hierarchy. And keyframe all of their rotations on frame 40 with Shift E. Then go a few frames later, let's say 30 frames later, and rotate a lot of these things. Maybe that's got to rotate. This one. Play around with it. Make it look interesting. Check your work in all of the viewports and make sure that you do not scrub in the timeline. If you do, you will lose your pose. Only move to a different point in the timeline if you explicitly want to reject the pose that you have. In order to keyframe all the objects, reselect the root object, in this case the joint swivel, reselect the entire hierarchy, edit select hierarchy, and press Shift E. And now keyframes are created on all of those objects. And as we scrub across here, we can see that we have a pose-to-pose interpolation. Let's check our work, make sure we don't have issues. For example, we've got some self-intersection here. We'll just want to correct that. We could, for example, combine the layered and pose-to-pose methods. We could insert keyframes only on certain objects. Perhaps we want to have it tilt down a little bit later. We can insert or move keyframes. Let's try the graph editor. I've got joint shoulder selected. Go to Window, Animation Editor's Graph Editor. And then dolly back a little bit here. Here's our second rotation. I'm going to select that keyframe and move it to a later point in time with the Move tool. Hold down Shift and drag. And as you'll see, with my time parked somewhere in the middle of the animation, it's lifting up at that point in time. Even though I'm not changing the value, I'm only changing the time index. I'm delaying that rotation. So now I've got more of a layered effect. We can check to see if that's intersecting now. It looks very close. I think we could sign off on that and say it's good enough. Cool. So at this point now we can think about how we're going to connect the object to the rig. And that can be done with the parent constraint as well. And in fact, we can parent constraint to multiple objects and transfer those links over time. This is an advantage that parent constraints have over standard links. If you have a standard link, it's forever. You can't break a link in the middle of an animation, nor can you create a link in the middle of an animation. A link is either there or it isn't for the entire duration of your animation. But with a parent constraint, you can have multiple targets and you can turn them on and off at different times. That's what I'll do here with the little can. In order to give this a little bit more realism, we can cause these clamps to tighten down. I'll go here to frame 59 was where the keyframe was for this pose. I'm going to select those two and keyframe them at this point, Shift E. Go forward a few frames and keyframe again with Shift E just to create a little bit of a pause there. And then maybe a few frames later, rotate them. Let's make sure we're in gimbal mode, which we are. Rotate those in. And then Shift E to keyframe them. Cool. And we can actually finish out the animation and then worry about our parent constraint later. It doesn't matter what order we do it in, but we're less likely to have issues if we do the entire animation first and then do the parent constraints. That's how I'm going to do it in this particular lesson. At this point now, I can do another pose-to-pose keyframe. I'm up to frame 75. I'll select the root. Once again, go to Edit, Select Hierarchy. Once again, Shift-E to keyframe all. And then we'll go down, let's say, 30 frames later and set some completely different pose. Very good. At that point, it's basically fully extended. And then once again, select the root, and then select the hierarchy, and Shift-E. Rewind, we'll play it back now. So we're basically throwing it across the room now. To make it easier to animate the can, I would recommend linking it to a locator. Create locator. It'll be created at the origin and very small. Set its local scale X, Y, and Z to a value of 20. Press Enter. And then in the top view, move it over in order to center it on the can. And we want to move it up as well, so it's pretty much centered on that geometry. And then link the can to the locator. Select the can, Shift select the locator, press P. We can also rename the locator. We'll call it Can Locator. This is just going to make it a little bit easier for us. We're separating the transforms out from the shapes. We're doing this throughout because, in fact, if we wanted to, we could swap out the models for different models and it wouldn't disturb our animation.